the possibility of death is ubiquitous. It's pervasive. We have to ask ourselves then, does this make things worse? It certainly feels, to my mind, as though it's an extra bad about the nature of death. It would be nice to get a breather. Imagine, if you will, that there were certain locations, certain vacation spots where as long as you were there, you couldn't die. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to go someplace and just for a period think to yourself, well, right now I don't have to worry about that. It doesn't even have to cross my mind. Maybe if there were these sort of death-free zones, they'd get rather crowded. So perhaps we should change the example. Instead of having death-free zones, imagine that there were death-free times. Just suppose, for whatever reason, nobody could die between 12 and 1. You could just sort of put it out of your mind. Wouldn't that be nice? All right, 1 o'clock, you take the mantle back on, but wouldn't it be nice to just have a certain period of time every day when you didn't have to even have it be so much as a remote possibility? Or suppose there were certain death-free activities. Maybe reading philosophy would be something that as long as you were doing it, you couldn't die, or as perhaps some religious traditions might have taught, as long as you were engaged in prayer, you couldn't die. Wouldn't that be nice? Or turn the entire thing the other way around. Suppose that most times and most activities were death-free, but certain activities introduce the possibility of dying. So you couldn't die unless you were engaged in certain activities. So you would be immortal, but not in the sense of immortal against your will. There'd be certain activities, perhaps, for example, putting a gun to your head that would put an end to your life. So even if immortality would be bad, there would be certain things you could do that could end it. Ask yourself, what sorts of activities would you engage in if you knew that those activities carried with them the risk of dying? So most of the time you couldn't die. What things would be so important to you that you'd be willing to suddenly risk death for the sake of doing those things? You like art. Is art important enough to you that you'd be prepared to look at a masterpiece if you knew that while you were enjoying it, you could die, but that wouldn't happen otherwise? Is sex great enough that you'd be prepared to run the risk of dying while you were engaged in sex? Again, it's a nice lens for asking yourself, what are the things that are most valuable to you, by asking which of them are so valuable you'd be prepared to do them even if they would introduce what isn't otherwise there, namely the risk of death.